June 19, 1944. Dawn. The Western Pacific burns gold beneath the rising sun. On the flight deck of USS Lexington, men in khaki and grease-stained coveralls move with quiet precision. The air tastes of salt and fuel. A line of blue-gray F-6F Hellcats crouch at the edge of the deck, wings folded like resting predators. Engines cough, roar, and settle into a steady growl. Below deck, ordnance crews arm belts of .50 caliber ammunition, tracer rounds like red stars waiting to be born. Over the horizon, somewhere beyond radar range, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft sweep toward the American carrier fleet. Pilots of the Imperial Navy, once masters of the Pacific sky, believe they are about to crush another task force as they had in 1942. They laugh in their cockpits, confident the legend of the Zero still rules these seas. But above the rolling decks, a new sound grows, the heavy-throated roar of Grumman Hellcats climbing into formation. Sunlight glints off their broad wings. Beneath them, the ocean stretches like polished steel. The sky over the Philippine Sea is about to decide the fate of carrier warfare itself. The Pacific War had entered its cruel middle years. By 1942, Japan's naval air arm seemed invincible. The Zero fighter, light, agile, and long-ranged, had swept across the Pacific like a storm, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. It ruled the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies, leaving American and British aircraft in smoking ruins. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force, the Kido Butai, had rewritten naval warfare, projecting power farther, faster, and deadlier than any fleet before it. At that time, America's carrier pilots fought with what they had, the stub-winged F-4F Wildcat. Rugged but outclassed, it was slower, less maneuverable, and less glamorous than the Zero. Yet it was in those desperate months of 1942, at Coral Sea, Midway, and over Guadalcanal, that the seeds of change were sown. Outnumbered and often outflown, American pilots learned to survive through discipline, teamwork, and innovation. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers went down in flames. It was a turning point, but not yet a victory. The U.S. Navy had struck a blow. The Japanese still commanded the edge in air-to-air combat. Their pilots were elite, men forged through years of peacetime training steeped in Bushido ideals of skill and sacrifice. They flew aircraft stripped of armor and self-sealing tanks, designed around one obsession: maneuverability. Every gram of metal was traded for speed and agility, and for a time that philosophy worked. But attrition is the silent killer of empires. In the grinding battles around Guadalcanal in late 1942, Japan's irreplaceable pilots began to vanish into the sea. Each lost aviator represented years of training, experience that could not be replaced quickly. Meanwhile, the United States, driven by an industrial momentum unmatched in history, built new carriers, new training schools, and new machines. By early 1943, the U.S. Navy faced a paradox. Its Wildcat had reached the end of its evolution. The faster F-4U Corsair was struggling with carrier landing issues. American engineers needed a fighter that could dominate the Pacific skies, one that any pilot could fly, maintain, and repair far from home amid the salt and heat of the tropics. At Grumman Aircraft on Long Island, that answer began taking shape under designer Leroy Grumman and his team. They listened carefully to the fleet's reports. The Zero could outturn the Wildcat, but not outdive it. It had delicate wings and no armor behind the pilot. It burned easily when hit. From that understanding came a guiding principle: not elegance, but toughness. The prototype XF-6F-1 first flew in June 1942. It was solid, heavy, reliable, perhaps too heavy. Engineers replaced its power plant with the massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same engine later used in the Corsair and Thunderbolt. The result was the F-6F-3 Hellcat, a blunt, powerful, forgiving brawler built to survive the Pacific's worst. Even as the aircraft neared readiness, the Navy struggled to keep its pilots alive long enough to fly it. Across the Pacific, small airfields and coral runways were dotted with burned-out wrecks. Radar was still primitive, early warning systems unreliable. Every dogfight was a brutal, twisting dance over endless blue water. Still, by late 1943, something shifted. The Allies had cracked Japan's expansion line. Guadalcanal was secure. The Solomons were falling. New carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, CV-10, joined the fleet, each carrying dozens of freshly trained pilots. They would fly the Hellcat. Japanese aviators began to notice a change. The American fighters they met over Rabaul and the Marshalls no longer dove away in panic. They attacked with controlled aggression, staying fast, hitting hard, and climbing out of range. Survivability replaced spectacle. The air war had become a test not of individual brilliance, but of systems, of who could train, fuel, arm, and field more effective machines for longer. Japan's advantage in experience was fading. America's advantage in logistics and adaptation was growing by the month. The stage was set for a technological and tactical confrontation that would redefine naval air combat. And on the horizon, the new Hellcat was about to make its presence felt. By 1943, the Pacific had become an engineer's war as much as a pilot's. The Hellcat, born from Grumman's design tables, was the physical expression of industrial pragmatism. No flash, no flare, just brutal efficiency. It was built in factories that never slept, assembled by thousands of women and men working under the drumbeat of total war. The aircraft rolled out by the hundreds each month, shipped west across a widening oceanic bridge of logistics. Maintenance ships and escort carriers. What made the F-6F different was not just its speed or firepower, it was its design philosophy. Every inch of it served survivability. Its cockpit was armored, its fuel tank self-sealing, its airframe overbuilt to absorb punishment. The wide landing gear made carrier landings forgiving, the broad wings stable in turbulent air. It could climb fast, dive steep, and turn tight enough to keep an enemy in sight without bleeding energy. For a Navy fighter, it was a revelation. American test pilots discovered that a Hellcat could take hits that would shred a Zero. In one trial, engineers fired 50 caliber rounds into its wings just to see how much damage it could tolerate before losing lift. The answer was astonishing, far more than a pilot would ever survive in a Japanese cockpit. The aircraft's simplicity made it a mechanic's dream. Engines swapped in hours, bullet holes patched overnight, parts interchangeable across squadrons. The result was a fighter designed not for the elite few, but for the thousands. The United States was turning air combat into a science of numbers, pilot training standardized, tactics refined, and production accelerated until superiority became inevitable. The shift in doctrine mirrored the machine itself. Early war American pilots had fought as individuals. By 1943, they fought as systems, guided by radar, coordinated by fighter direction officers aboard carriers, vectored onto incoming raids before the enemy ever saw them. The Hellcat fit perfectly into this networked approach. It didn't need to be the fastest or the most graceful. It needed to survive, to intercept, and to return. Across the ocean, Japan faced an unraveling nightmare. The once proud Kido Butai was hollowing out. Its carriers still sailed, but its air groups were ghosts of their former selves. Training schools struggled to replace losses. Young recruits, some with fewer than 200 flight hours, climbed into the cockpits once reserved for aces. Fuel shortages limited training flights. Experienced instructors had been lost over the Solomons and Rabaul. The Zero remained lethal in the hands of a master, but the masters were gone. By early 1944, this imbalance became fatal. The U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force, organized under Admiral Mark Mitcher and commanded operationally by Admiral Raymond Spruance, began to roll westward. These weren't tentative raids anymore. They were industrial sledgehammers, task forces of 4, sometimes 6, carriers operating together, protected by cruisers, destroyers, and oilers capable of refueling at sea. The Pacific had become an assembly line of naval power. At the heart of it, the Hellcat reigned supreme. In combat trials over the Marshall Islands and Truk Lagoon, it proved devastating. On February 16, 1944, Hellcats helped annihilate the Japanese base at Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Hundreds of enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground and in the air. Few American planes failed to return. Reports filtered back to Tokyo of pilots describing new, thick-winged American monsters that dove faster than anything they had seen. Japanese commanders dismissed them at first, another Allied exaggeration, but by the spring of 1944, the truth was undeniable. Wherever American carriers struck, the skies filled with Hellcats. And they weren't just fighting machines. They were symbols of a larger transformation. Behind each Hellcat stood a chain of supply stretching back across the Pacific. Floating dry docks at Ulithi, repair ships at Pearl, logistics convoys threading through submarine-infested seas. America had learned to project not just firepower, but sustainment. For Japan, the coming battles would no longer be duels of pilots. They would be tests of endurance fought between nations running on entirely different tempos. By June 1944, that confrontation was ready to erupt over the Marianas. The Imperial Navy, desperate to halt the American advance, prepared one final massive strike. They still believed their Zero could turn the tide. They had yet to meet the full strength of the Hellcat. The human dimension. For the men who flew them, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a lifeline. By 1944, most American carrier pilots were young, many barely in their 20s, trained in months rather than years. They had not grown up on the flight decks of pre-war carriers like the Japanese elites. They were the product of an industrial system that produced warriors as predictably as it did engines. Their instructors hammered survival into them. Keep your speed, use your altitude, never turn fight a zero. The lessons learned by the first Wildcat squadrons over Guadalcanal had been distilled into doctrine. To these pilots, the Hellcat inspired confidence the moment they strapped in. Its cockpit sat high with excellent visibility, its handling predictable even in combat dives. Many described it as docile until angry, a gentle beast that became unstoppable once unleashed. When tracer rounds tore through its fuselage, it usually brought its pilot home. Over time, that reliability forged trust, and trust is what wins air wars. In contrast, Japanese pilots lived under a different code. Their culture prized individual mastery and sacrifice. Each mission was a chance for personal glory, and death was an accepted outcome. But the cost of that ethos was unsustainable. By mid-1944, few Japanese aviators expected to survive long enough to teach anyone what they had learned. The U.S. pilot might fear death. His Japanese counterpart expected it. The psychological equation had reversed. The tactical transformation tactics win dogfights. Strategy wins wars. Between those two layers, the Hellcat changed everything. The early days of 1942 had taught brutal lessons. The Zero's lightweight agility dominated turning engagements. The Wildcat's salvation came from teamwork, specifically the Thatch Weave, invented by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. It was a simple but brilliant concept. Two fighters flying parallel, weaving toward each other so that an enemy pursuing one would be caught in the guns of the other. The Hellcat carried that logic into the next generation. With superior dive and climb performance, it didn't need to engage in turning battles. Instead, American pilots used energy tactics. Boom and zoom. They attacked from altitude, fired in short, precise bursts, and climbed away before the Zero could respond. It was disciplined, methodical, almost industrial combat. Every Hellcat carried 6 .50 caliber Browning M2s, each firing at 800 rounds per minute. Against lightly built Japanese aircraft, that firepower was overwhelming. Radar coordination magnified the effect. Fighter direction officers aboard carriers tracked enemy formations on scopes, guiding combat air patrols into position before the attackers even saw them. For the first time in naval history, a carrier's defensive air umbrella became predictive, not reactive. By the time Japanese bombers appeared visually, they were often already bleeding fire into the ocean below. Discipline replaced improvisation. Coordination replaced instinct. The Pacific skies were turning from dueling arenas into managed battle networks, and the Hellcat was the central node. The technological edge. The F-6F Hellcat was not glamorous, but it was genius in steel and rivets. Where the Japanese A6M0 had been designed around the pilot's skill, the Hellcat was designed around the pilot's survival. It was a machine born from data, not ego. With its massive R2800 double Wasp engine, the Hellcat produced nearly 2,000 horsepower, almost twice that of the Zero. Its top speed of 380 miles per hour outpaced most Japanese fighters, and its climb rate let it reach combat altitude in minutes. It carried nearly twice the fuel, giving it a range that matched the long Pacific distances. The Zero could stay aloft for hours, but only because it carried no armor. The Hellcat achieved endurance through fuel efficiency and capacity, not vulnerability. Equally important was durability. A single hit that ignited a Zero's fuel tank often left a Hellcat smoking, but flyable. Pilots returned with shredded tails, holed wings, even missing control surfaces, and still landed on pitching carrier decks. Maintenance crews marveled at how easily the aircraft came apart for repair. Every system was built for redundancy: hydraulic, electrical, even the landing gear. The Zero was an artist's fighter, light, graceful, fatal when flown by a master. The Hellcat was an engineer's fighter, simple, rugged, reliable in any hands. One represented a vanished era of craftsmanship, the other heralded the age of industrial air power. And in war, industrial power would prove decisive. As the tactical skies shifted, these three dimensions, human, tactical, and technological, interlocked into a system of overwhelming effectiveness. The Hellcat was not simply an aircraft. It was a manifestation of America's wartime evolution from survival to supremacy. The next question became one of leadership and endurance. Could this system hold when tested against Japan's last desperate gamble in the Central Pacific? Leadership and doctrine. Behind every victory in the Pacific stood commanders who understood how to transform technology into doctrine. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the quiet Texan who commanded the Pacific Fleet, believed in one principle above all: coordination. Every component, carriers, submarines, logistics, and aircraft, had to function as a living organism. His subordinates, Admirals Raymond Spruance and Mark Mitcher, brought that idea to life. Spruance was analytical, calm, and methodical. Mitcher, a pilot himself, understood the rhythm of carrier warfare, the launch cycles, the deck choreography, the timing of airstrikes. Together, they developed the Fast Carrier Task Force, an innovation that revolutionized naval operations. Instead of deploying single carriers vulnerable to attack, they grouped 4, sometimes 6, together under a single umbrella of escort ships and shared air patrols. This created flexibility, mass, and constant striking power. Leadership doctrine evolved with every operation. The Americans learned to rotate air groups between combat and rest to cross-train pilots and to synchronize strikes with submarine reconnaissance. Every engagement became a rehearsal for the next. By the time the Marianas Campaign began, the command structure operated like a precision clock. Across the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy had no equivalent system. Admirals Jisaburo Ozawa and Minechi Koga were capable men, but their doctrine was locked in 1942, offensive, aggressive, and rigid. Their fleet sailed far from reliable fuel lines. With inexperienced air crews and outdated communication protocols, Japan's leadership still believed that the spirit of the pilot could compensate for the machine. But by mid-1944, the war had moved beyond spirit. The enemy's decline. Japan entered 1944 fighting a war it could no longer sustain. Its early war dominance had rested on a small cadre of highly trained pilots, excellent optics, and a code of personal mastery. But modern war punishes what cannot scale. Training schools that once produced 100 pilots per year were now expected to produce 1,000, but without fuel, instructors, or aircraft. The result was catastrophic. Replacement pilots often logged fewer than 100 flight hours before being sent into combat, barely enough to master formation flying, much less carrier landings or gunnery. Maintenance suffered just as badly. Japan's wartime economy was strangled by blockade. Factories faced shortages of aluminum, steel, and aviation fuel. Even the fabled Mitsubishi Zeros were being built with inferior alloys and untested engines. Carriers like Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho still symbolized strength, but inside their hangars were squadrons filled with rookies. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese commanders knew their air groups lacked the skill to challenge the Americans head-on, but retreat was unthinkable. Doctrinal pride demanded attack. As the U.S. fleet advanced into the Marianas, Ozawa's plan for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea reflected that desperation. He intended to lure the Americans within range of land-based aircraft from the Marianas and launch one massive, coordinated strike. It was audacious, but the pilots executing it were undertrained, their navigation untested, and their radio discipline fragile. Japan's decline wasn't just mechanical, it was systemic. The empire had entered the war believing that quality could compensate for quantity. By 1944, the inverse was true. America's quantity had achieved its own quality. The unsung weapon. While Hellcats filled the skies, another miracle unfolded below the horizon, the logistical revolution that made their dominance possible. No navy in history had ever fought so far from home, and no nation but the United States could sustain it. Floating dry docks, repair ships, and oilers created a mobile base across the Pacific. At Ulithi Atoll, what began as a quiet lagoon turned into the largest naval anchorage on Earth, a floating city of fuel tanks, machine shops, and supply depots. Ships could rearm, refuel, and repair without ever returning to Pearl Harbor. The fast carrier force could therefore remain operational for months on end. For every pilot in the air, dozens of sailors, engineers, and logisticians kept the system alive. Tankers replenished aviation fuel at sea, while destroyers circled to screen submarines. Cargo ships delivered spare parts, ammunition, and food. The scale of this network dwarfed anything Japan could conceive. The Hellcat thrived in this environment because it was built for it. Its modular construction meant parts could be swapped between carriers, repairs made in hours rather than days. The machine embodied the spirit of America's wartime production: mass, standardization, and relentless reliability. By 1944, the United States had produced over 12,000 Hellcats, enough to equip every frontline carrier and replace losses many times over. Japan, by comparison, was still struggling to produce enough aircraft to fill its decks. In the Pacific, logistics wasn't the hidden front. It was the decisive one. The outcome of every dogfight was written long before the pilots met, in the factories of Long Island and the convoys of the Pacific. As these forces, leadership, decline, and logistics, converged, the stage was fully set. The Imperial Navy was sailing into its final carrier engagement, unaware that the balance of air power had shifted permanently. The Hellcat had matured. The Americans were ready. The next battle would prove it beyond question. June 1944. The Pacific was vast, but the fate of its skies was narrowing to a single expanse of ocean between the Mariana Islands and the Philippine Sea. The American invasion of Saipan had begun on June 15th. For Japan, losing the Marianas meant losing its outer ring of defense and placing the home islands within range of American B-29 bombers. It was unthinkable. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, 9 carriers strong, sortied from Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines, bound northward. It was to be Japan's last great gamble. Ozawa believed he could overwhelm the Americans with numbers, more than 400 carrier aircraft, backed by another 400 land-based planes from Guam and Rota. He also believed his reach exceeded that of the American carriers. If he could launch his strikes first, using longer-ranged aircraft, he might catch the Americans off guard and reverse the tide. But the reality beneath those numbers was grim. Many of those 400 carrier aircraft were flown by green pilots. Navigation errors, poor radio coordination, and fuel mismanagement plagued every rehearsal. The Imperial Navy was fighting with ghosts of its former self. Across the ocean, the U.S. Fifth Fleet moved deliberately westward. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the overall operation. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, the fast carrier striking arm. Their intelligence officers, fed by intercepted Japanese communications and submarine reconnaissance, knew Ozawa was coming. Unlike Midway 2 years earlier, the Americans would not be surprised. On June 18th, the two fleets began to close. By dawn on June 19th, radar screens aboard the carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown flickered to life. Distant echoes swept across the scopes, multiple incoming waves. Fighter direction officers began calculating intercept vectors. Combat air patrols were scrambled. In less than 20 minutes, the Pacific sky filled with the thunder of engines. This would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though for the men in those cockpits, there was nothing easy about it. Hellcat squadrons clawed their way up through broken clouds. Each pilot had been briefed. Conserve altitude, stay disciplined, engage only when advantage is certain. At 10 a.m., radar reported the first Japanese strike inbound, 68 fighters, 80 dive bombers, and 70 torpedo planes. They never reached their targets. Vectors were perfect. The Hellcats dove from 20,000 feet, sunlight glinting off their wings. The first Japanese formation dissolved under streams of tracer fire. The difference in training was mercilessly clear. American pilots broke, rolled, and climbed in perfect coordination. Japanese formations scattered, their defensive circles collapsing in seconds. Many were shot down before they even sighted the carriers. One veteran pilot, Loanter Alex Vracu of VF-16 aboard Lexington, scored 6 kills in a single sortie. His gun camera footage captured the sheer brutality of the engagement, Zeros bursting into flames, their wings shearing away as they fell into the sea. Within hours, more than 200 Japanese planes had been destroyed. The second and third attack waves fared no better. Hellcats, now operating under radar guidance, intercepted them over 100 miles from the fleet. The Americans had turned air defense into a mathematical science. Every raid that slipped through was greeted by walls of anti-aircraft fire from destroyers and cruisers below. By midday, the battle had become one-sided. The Hellcat had done what it was built to do: absorb punishment, deliver destruction, and bring its pilots home. Even damaged planes limped back to their carriers, hydraulics shot out, wings torn, landing gear stuck half down. Flight deck crews waved them in, engines smoking, tires shredding on touchdown. Mechanics worked through the night to patch the bullet holes and send them back out by dawn. In contrast, the Japanese carrier decks were silent. Their first 3 strike waves had been annihilated. Fewer than a dozen aircraft returned to the fleet. Ozawa still believed his land-based air groups on Guam would strike next. unaware that those bases were being pounded relentlessly by American carrier bombers. When those remaining aircraft finally launched, they flew straight into waiting Hellcats. By evening, the U.S. Navy's carrier groups had destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft without losing a single ship. The Pacific sky was littered with smoke columns, drifting parachutes, and oil fires stretching to the horizon. Yet Admiral Mitcher was not satisfied. His scouts reported the enemy carriers still at large, somewhere to the west. The day's slaughter had crippled Japan's air power, but to end the threat, the carriers themselves had to be sunk. Night was falling over the Philippine Sea. The decision Mitcher made next would push the fleet into one of the most daring operations in carrier history. The Hellcats would not rest yet. Darkness spread across the Philippine Sea, but the horizon still flickered orange with burning wrecks. The Hellcat pilots returned to their decks, exhausted, faces streaked with sweat and cordite. Some had flown 3 sorties in a single day. They had crushed the enemy air arm, but the Japanese carriers themselves, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, still roamed somewhere beyond radar range. Admiral Mitcher wanted them gone. Late on June 19th, American submarines began to find them. The USS Albacore, patrolling northeast of the Marianas, detected a contact, a massive flat top moving fast. Taiho, Japan's newest carrier, pride of the fleet. The sub maneuvered for a shot, fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, and dived. Only 1 hit, but it was enough. The explosion ruptured aviation fuel lines deep inside the ship. At first, damage control seemed to contain it. Then vapor began to accumulate below decks. Hours later, a spark, perhaps from an electric motor, ignited the fumes. The blast tore through the carrier's hangar decks, lifting its armored flight deck like a lid. Taiho sank with over 1,600 men. South of her, the USS Kavala stalked another giant, Shokaku. At 11:50 a.m., Kavala fired 6 torpedoes. 3 struck true. Flames and fuel erupted through the ship's length. Within half an hour, Shokaku rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. 2 of Japan's frontline carriers were gone in a single day, victims not of aircraft, but of an unseen undersea enemy. When dawn broke on June 20th, Admiral Ozawa's once proud mobile fleet was fleeing westward with what remained of its air groups. He had fewer than 100 aircraft left. Mitcher's reconnaissance planes located the retreating formation just before dusk. The range, 200 to 75 miles, beyond safe recovery distance for most American aircraft. Launching an evening strike meant the pilots would have to find and land on their carriers in darkness, an operation almost unheard of in 1944. Mitcher weighed the risk, then gave the order: launch them all. The decks roared back to life. Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers thundered into the fading light, over 200 aircraft in total. Pilots knew the fuel math didn't favor them. They'd have to hit fast and find their way home by night. The sun vanished as they approached the Japanese fleet. Searchlights stabbed upward. Tracer fire arced through the dusk. Hellcats strafed the decks of Zuikaku and Junyo, cutting down gunners. Bombs and torpedoes found their marks on the carrier Hiyo, which erupted in a fireball and vanished. The Japanese formation broke apart, survivors fleeing west under cover of night. Then came the hardest part: the return. As the first American aircraft approached their own fleet, the sky was black. There were no beacons, no lights. Carriers were running dark to avoid submarine detection. Mitcher faced an agonizing choice: keep the lights off and save the ships, or turn them on and save the men. He chose the men. Turn on the lights, he ordered. Every carrier, cruiser, and destroyer lit its deck and searchlights, blazing white against the sea. It was a beacon that could have guided torpedoes as easily as pilots, but it saved hundreds of lives. Flares hissed into the night to guide the returning squadrons. Some pilots landed on the wrong decks. Others ditched near destroyers, who plucked them from the dark waves. One after another, the Hellcats came down, some on fumes, some with landing gear half-locked, some sliding off the decks as they touched down. When the last plane was accounted for, 20 had been lost to fuel exhaustion or crashes. But the gamble had worked. By morning, the scale of the destruction was clear. In 2 days, Japan had lost over 600 aircraft, 3 carriers, and nearly all its veteran pilots. The Imperial Navy's carrier arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was finished. It would never again launch a major offensive. The Hellcat's kill ratio that week was staggering, over 350 enemy aircraft destroyed for fewer than 30 losses. American pilots returned with victory tallies that defied belief. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy ruled the Pacific skies uncontested. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a triumph of pilots, but of an entire system: radar, logistics, training, production, and leadership. The laughter of Japanese pilots that morning, the confidence of 1942, had vanished into the ocean. And the Hellcat, built in quiet factories half a world away, had become the sword that ended Japan's aerial empire. The Pacific War would grind on for another year, but the balance had shifted forever. When dawn rose over the Philippine Sea on June 21, 1944, the water was still littered with the floating remains of Japan's carrier dream. Oil slicks stretching for miles, bits of wreckage glinting under the morning sun, and the scattered lifeboats of men who had once believed themselves invincible. The silence that followed was not just physical, it was historical. The age of the Imperial Navy's dominance had ended in those 2 days of aerial slaughter. For the Americans, the victory was absolute. Meecher's Task Force 58 returned to its Saipan operations with near-total air superiority. With the skies cleared, U.S. Marines on Saipan could call in airstrikes at will, devastating Japanese positions. The link between sea and land, so critical in amphibious warfare, had finally been perfected. Every aircraft launched from the decks of the Essex-class carriers now served as both sword and shield, projecting power deep into enemy territory while guarding the fleet from counterattack. The numbers tell their own story. Japan lost over 600 aircraft and 3 frontline carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, in exchange for 123 American aircraft, most of which were lost to fuel exhaustion or night landings rather than combat. But numbers alone don't capture the deeper wound. The Imperial Navy lost more than hardware. It lost its airmen, the last remnants of an elite corps that had once conquered half the Pacific. The few pilots who returned would find themselves training hastily drafted replacements, men who would never achieve the same skill. Admiral Ozawa, leading the shattered remnants of his fleet back toward Okinawa, could only send a grim report to Tokyo. "The enemy's air power is overwhelming. Our losses are beyond calculation." His words were both confession and epitaph. The Japanese naval staff tried to frame the battle as a tactical setback rather than a catastrophe, but no one at the top could ignore what it meant. Japan's carriers had become hulls without wings, floating symbols of a past that no longer existed. Back in Washington, news of the victory electrified the Navy Department. For the first time, the U.S. had fought a carrier battle purely on its own terms, initiated by radar, coordinated by doctrine, sustained by logistics. The lessons of Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz had been learned, codified, and executed with ruthless precision. The Hellcat had not just performed, it had transformed naval aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea gave the U.S. Navy something intangible, yet decisive: confidence. American carrier commanders now knew they could fight anywhere, at any range, against any force. The fleet was no longer a fragile experiment. It was an unstoppable weapon of state power. Within days, attention turned to Guam and Tinian. By August, both would fall, giving the United States the airfields it needed to launch B-29 bombers against Japan's industrial heartland. The fall of the Marianas was the beginning of the end. For the Japanese people, the defeat took time to sink in. Wartime propaganda minimized the losses, calling them temporary reverses. Yet within the ranks, the truth circulated quietly. The Imperial Navy could no longer defend its empire, nor its home islands. The once mythic Zero had met its successor and found it merciless. Meanwhile, the Hellcat became a symbol aboard every American carrier deck. Pilots who once dreaded facing Japanese fighters now took pride in their mounts. Mechanics painted kill marks beneath the cockpit glass. Air crews began to speak of Hellcat Heaven, a phrase born from confidence that their machine could do anything asked of it. It wasn't arrogance. It was earned assurance, born from survival. The Pacific had entered a new phase. America no longer fought for balance. It fought for closure. The enemy that had once mocked the slow American carriers was now broken and retreating. Yet even amid victory, the men aboard Task Force 58 understood what it had cost. The faces of downed pilots lingered in their memories. The ocean had claimed friend and foe alike. Still, there was no pause, no time for mourning. Orders were already arriving. The fleet was to refuel, rearm, and prepare for the next assault, Leyte, Okinawa, and beyond. The Hellcat had cleared the sky. Now the war would move toward Japan itself. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked more than the destruction of Japan's carrier air arm. It marked the end of an era. Before June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been the most experienced carrier force on Earth, with a doctrine born of daring and discipline. After June 1944, it was a hollow name attached to drifting steel. In 2 days, the balance of air power in the Pacific had flipped permanently. American analysts were quick to study why. What they found confirmed the long evolution of war from art to industry. Japan had entered the Pacific War with less than 2,000 trained naval aviators. They had been the world's best, men of precision and pride, but the empire never found a way to replace them. Every pilot lost over the Solomons, and New Guinea was gone forever, his experience buried in the sea. By contrast, the United States had built a machine for teaching. New training programs produced pilots by the tens of thousands, standardized in procedure, molded to the same doctrine. Quantity, for the first time in history, had become a kind of quality. And the machine they flew, the F-6F Hellcat, was the perfect partner. In the months after the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat's combat record grew into legend. It would account for roughly 75% of all aerial victories credited to the U.S. Navy during World War II. By war's end, its kill ratio exceeded 19-1. It was not the fastest fighter of the war, nor the most advanced, but it was the most balanced, the most forgiving, and the most perfectly matched to its environment. Pilots loved it because it loved them back. Its cockpit armor saved lives. Its 6 Brownings shredded enemy aircraft. It could fly through flak and still limp home. It was, as one pilot later said, the fighter that let ordinary men do extraordinary things. For Japan, the months following the battle were a descent into silence. The survivors of the carrier air groups were reorganized into shore-based units, flying older models or experimental interceptors. They would fight again, over the Philippines, over Iwo Jima, and finally over Okinawa, but without the skill or coordination that once defined them. By 1945, desperation gave birth to the kamikaze. The elite pilots of 1941 had sought mastery. The youth of 1945 sought martyrdom. The contrast could not have been starker. The Hellcat pilots flew for survival, returning home to write letters, to eat, to live another day. The kamikazes flew for death, bound to a code that no longer served strategy. Two philosophies of war met in the Pacific sky, one built on endurance, the other on extinction, and only one could sustain itself. The technological momentum unleashed by the Hellcat carried forward into the next generation. Its lessons, pilot protection, range, reliability, radar integration, shaped the jet fighters that followed, the F-8F Bearcat, the F-9F Panther, and beyond. Naval aviation had reached maturity. The U.S. Navy no longer depended on isolated acts of heroism. It operated as an integrated system of machines, men, and doctrine. When the war ended in August 1945, many of the same Hellcats that had flown over the Philippine Sea were still flying, patched, worn, oil-stained, but ready. They had crossed an ocean's worth of battles and returned home victorious. At Grumman's Long Island factory, the last Hellcat rolled off the line that November. The workers, mostly women, signed their names inside the fuselage before it shipped out, knowing that their work had changed history. In Japan, survivors like Admiral Ozawa could only reflect on what had been lost. He would later write that his pilots fought bravely, but against an enemy who no longer feared us. It was the truest measure of what the Hellcat had achieved, not just aerial superiority, but psychological dominance. The Imperial Navy, which had once laughed at the clumsy American carriers, now feared the thunder of their engines before ever seeing their silhouettes. By the war's close, the U.S. Navy had built 12,275 Hellcats. Japan had fewer than 1,500 operational fighters left in all services combined. The equation was final, irreversible. The skies of the Pacific belonged to America now. And in every corner of that victory, on every deck, in every logbook, in every scarred fuselage, one name was etched in oil and smoke: Hellcat. The war's horizon was shifting toward its final question, not how to win, but how to end. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a confrontation of machines. It was a reckoning between two visions of warfare. On one side, Japan fought with the spirit of the individual, with valor shaped by tradition and sacrifice. On the other, America fought with the strength of systems, of factories, logistics, and shared knowledge. In June 1944, those two worlds collided, and one of them vanished beneath the waves. The Hellcat became the symbol of that transformation. It was not elegant or poetic. It was blunt, durable, and designed for mass production, everything that Japan's warrior code disdained. Yet in its steel simplicity lay the future of modern war. It represented a new kind of heroism, one rooted not in reckless glory, but in precision, teamwork, and survival. Every rivet of the Hellcat told the story of an industrial democracy learning how to fight total war. Engineers who designed for the mechanic, mechanics who built for the pilot, and pilots who fought for the fleet. Together they formed a chain of endurance stronger than any ideology. For the Japanese aviators who perished over the Philippine Sea, the end was not dishonor, but inevitability. They were the final guardians of a philosophy that could no longer survive in a mechanized age. Their courage was unquestionable, but courage alone cannot outfly physics, production, or time. When historians later called the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the name missed its quiet tragedy. It was not easy, not simple, and not bloodless. It was the moment the Pacific changed forever, the day air superiority became industrial, and survival replaced spectacle. From that day forward, the blue-gray silhouette of the Hellcat ruled the ocean skies. It carried a message written not in arrogance, but in endurance. That war belongs to those who can learn faster, build stronger, and outlast every storm. And as the Pacific fell silent in 1945, the last Hellcats circled above the carriers that had launched them, wings gleaming against the setting sun, guardians of a world they had helped to end and of a peace they had made possible.